Lecture 7.1, Property Rights and Economic Reasoning. In Lesson 7, we're going to examine the last of the institutions we've identified as fundamental to economic growth, property rights and the rule of law. We'll answer the question of what property rights have to do with whether countries are rich or poor, but we'll take a somewhat circuitous route to get there. First, we need to spend some time creating a working vocabulary and identifying the connections between property rights and the other growth-promoting institutions. So, time to define terms and to state what is probably obvious but needs stating nonetheless. Property doesn't have rights. People do. The 1960 protesters' slogan, "People, not property," didn't make much sense then, and it definitely doesn't now. The issue is more accurately one of which people have property rights and which people don't. And in order to sort out the ramifications of having or not having property rights, we need to start by recognizing that property rights are human rights. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that property rights are the ultimate human right. Check out the definition on the screen. Property rights are the formal and informal rules governing the ownership, use, and transfer of goods, services, and resources. I'd direct your attention to the resources part, starting with labor, a human being's time and effort in the productive process. It hasn't been all that long in the history of the world that a person was considered to have a fundamental right to the fruits of his own labor. And sadly, there are still places where the rules of the game, often informal rules, but nonetheless constraining, still deny people the right to self that is a premise in the developed world. If property rights are rules governing the ownership, use, and transfer of things, another way to put it is that property rights define the privileges and limitations of ownership. That's a useful place to start in getting students to recognize that saying, "it's mine," or "I own it," can mean a lot of different things. Take a look at the pictures on the screen and think about the privileges and limitations of saying, "that's mine," in terms of your ability to use or transfer. Start with the dog. You can use it as a pet. That's a privilege. You can breed it and sell the puppies. Oh, but wait, that use is limited, isn't it? You have to meet health standards, and you might even have to get a license. Okay, let's see. You could hunt with it, but again, there are limits. Seasons, licenses, leash laws, etc. You could sell your pet or give it away, but you can't abuse it. All right, next. What about a ski lift or water park or theater ticket? You don't really own anything but the paper ticket. You've simply purchased a use right. And look at the back. You can't transfer it. Plus, your property right expires when the sun goes down or the doors close or the lift shuts. All right, last example, but not least. Here's your mountain cabin next to a stream. What about the water in the stream? It's on your property, but do you own it? Or maybe a better question is, how do you own it? What are your privileges and limitations? Over time, economists and the law have developed a useful analogy of property rights as a bundle of sticks. Sometimes owning something means having all the sticks in the bundle. We'd call that full property rights. But much more often, we might not have all the sticks, or some of the sticks are skinny twigs, and others are big, thick logs. So the components of the full bundle of property rights are captured in these three questions. Are the property rights clearly defined? Are the property rights divestible, or another word for that is transferable? And are the property rights defendable or enforceable? When property rights are clearly defined, the privileges and limitations of use can be determined, and the less effort it takes to do that, the better. So if it says right on the ticket, non-transferable, you don't waste time and effort finding out whether you can give it to your cousin or arguing with the doorman about whether or not you can go in. Divestibility or transferability determines whether you can sell, give away, throw away, or in any other way divest yourself of the right to your property. Think about that one for a minute. There are more rules about that than you initially thought, huh? I mean, there are even things you can't just throw away, like this old can of paint or the used motor oil from your car. And finally, are the property rights defendable? Can they be enforced? Because if you can't enforce them, it doesn't matter what other sticks are in the bundle. They don't mean much of anything. The examples here range from frustrating to poignant to devastating. If you're a history teacher, think of the Cherokee Trail of Tears. The Cherokees had clearly defined property rights, but they were rendered moot by President Jackson. Remember his infamous challenge to Judge Marshall in the Supreme Court, "Let's see you enforce your decision." If you're teaching geography, think of how informal rules and the refusal of local authorities to enforce formal laws continue to dispossess the untouchables, or Dalits as they call themselves, in many of the communities in India. If you're teaching in some big American cities, think of neighborhoods where policing isn't effective in protecting students' skateboards or athletic shoes or electronic gadgets. So, when we think of property rights in institutional terms, economists generally recognize three sets of rules of the game, or three institutional configurations to that bundle of sticks: private ownership, common ownership, and collective ownership. Each of these sets of rules of the game creates incentives that shape how people use their property. In private ownership, which we're most used to, the bundle of property rights sticks is held individually, or by a group like a corporation that has the status of an individual in the law. While we recognize, of course, that there can be big differences in the strength and weakness of those rights, we also know that private ownership creates incentives for people to use their property wisely and to consider its value for the future. This is an understanding that's captured in the saying that people tend to take better care of things they own. And it's illustrated by comparing the cleanliness of public bathrooms to those in your home, or the school cafeteria to your own kitchen, your yard to the public park. If, as the owner, you can capture the value of your property, you have a strong incentive to consider carefully how best to do that, both now and in the future. In common ownership, rights are held by the group. All have access and none can be excluded. Unlike private ownership, which creates incentives for the owner to keep an eye to the future, common ownership places the focus directly on the present, and it encourages overuse and degradation of resources. If you don't get it, someone else will. You saw this in action when you watched the video of the fish game classroom activity. Oh, and by the way, if you haven't watched the video, you may want to leave the lecture and do so, and then return here. The video is very short, about 10 minutes, and it convincingly illustrates that ownership incentives shape behavior. Because the owners of a commons have no ability to exclude others or constrain others' use, their best strategy is to get as much out of the resource as they can. Thus, they contribute to the very scenario of overuse that they fear. Dubbed the tragedy of the commons by ecologist Garrett Hardin in the mid-20th century, the phenomenon of overuse of common property has been recognized for centuries, from overgrazing of common pasturage in medieval times to overharvesting of Atlantic fish stocks today. Much attention in environmental economics, something we'll look at in the second half of this lecture, is focused on how to prevent the tragedy of the commons from degrading valuable and scarce environmental resources like air, water, wilderness, and wildlife. The third set of property rights rules is called collective ownership. Collective property is owned in common, but its use is administered by government. It can also be called public property because citizens, that is the public's ownership privileges, are constrained or limited by the government. Sometimes collective ownership institutions emerge as an effort to avoid the tragedy of the commons. For example, government steps in with its coercive powers to tax or to exclude, in an effort to prevent the overuse and deterioration of a resource like our national forests. Unfortunately, collective arrangements are much like common property in terms of removing incentives for enhancing, preserving, or sometimes even paying attention to the value of the property. The situation is summed up nicely in the saying that if everybody owns it, it's as if no one does. Okay, so now we have some background and a common vocabulary, and we can move to apply our general understanding of property rights and incentives to two specific issues. First, environmental quality in both rich and poor nations, and second, what property rights have to do with wealth and poverty. We'll look at these specific issues in the context of our 5 economic reasoning principles, starting with number 5 first. As many of you know who have tried to have a reasoned discussion of an environmental issue in class, people, especially teenage students with their relative lack of life experience and their tendency to see things in black and white, hold strong emotional positions about the environment. Now, that's not particularly surprising since many adults are also emotionally invested in the issue, and since environmental hyperbole is a staple offering of the news media. So, it's time for us to trot out economic reasoning principle number 5 again. Crossing your arms and saying, "That's my opinion," should be the start of a conversation about environmental issues, not the end of it. And truly, it would help a lot to not cross your arms. I'm just saying. Like all economic analysis, thinking about environmental issues is more productive when it's based on empirical evidence. And we'll try to provide real-world illustrations and examples as we go along. If we now return to first principles, scarcity, choice, and cost, we've got a good place to start discussion. First thing we need to know is, do these reasoning tools even apply? Is the environment an economic good? Well, we can answer that question by using the same criteria we use for other things that we want and need. Things like gasoline or blue jeans or hamburgers. So, question 1, is it scarce? Question 2, is there an opportunity cost to having more of it? And question 3, does people's consumption respond to incentives? Now, I'd give that 3 big yeses. Yes, the environment is scarce. And we know that because we don't have as much of it for enjoying, for harvesting other resources, whatever, as we want and need. Yes, there's an opportunity cost to using the environment in any particular way. Drill, and we may disrupt wildlife, but we'll have more oil. Don't drill, and higher energy prices, but it's harder on the poor. And third, yes, we know that people use less of environmental amenities as the price increases. Say, entry fees to a campground in the national parks, or the price of travel tickets to pristine wilderness sites. So, despite our students, and, well, let's be honest, maybe ours too, our gut feeling that the environment is fundamentally different from others' goods, services, and resources, it turns out that it's not. Like blue jeans and hamburgers, environmental amenities and environmental quality are economic goods. They're scarce, our choices about how to use them impose opportunity costs, and the way we use them responds to incentives. Now, your first reaction to that might be, oh no. But if you think about it, the fact that the environment is an economic good is actually good news, because it means we can use our economic reasoning tools to get the most value out of those scarce environmental resources. And we'll use the environment that we have in the ways that we value the most. Let's look at marginal analysis, the comparison of additional costs and additional benefits. We've used it to look at hiring and productive decisions by employers and entrepreneurs, and it's also going to be useful in dealing with environmental problems like pollution cleanup, for example. Imagine that a badly degraded stream runs through the greenbelt in your housing development, and the homeowners would like to clean it up. A local company submits an environmental mitigation bid to the homeowners association and promises that for a mere $5 million, the stream can be beautiful, the water clean enough to drink, and property values will rise by $7.5 million. $7.5 million in benefits for $5 million in costs seems like a no-brainer. Of course, each homeowner has to consider what his share might be, but it's a big community with lots of homeowners, so $5 million seems doable. And without even being asked to, people will consider the opportunity cost of having higher homeowners' dues against the benefit to them of the improved environment and resale value of their homes. But if all they do is to compare the total cost and total benefit, they're missing some crucial information. Fortunately, somebody on the Homeowners Association board took economics in high school and asks the environmental mitigation company to break out the bid to show the various steps of the project. You see the results in the chart on the screen in $1 million increments. That $1 million is the marginal cost of each stage of the project. So take a minute and read through the chart. Okay, next, a realtor on the board adds an estimate of the value of the improvements for each $1 million spent. We'd call those the marginal benefits. So what we need to do is compare the marginal costs and the marginal benefits. And we're going to get a much different picture than if we just compare total costs and total benefits. Suddenly, clean enough to drink doesn't seem to be worth the additional cost. And even at the other levels, the homeowners can ask themselves, how clean is clean enough? Unfortunately, our national conversations about pollution cleanup are often couched in all or nothing terms rather than in marginal terms. And the reality is that 100% clean is neither practical nor desirable, despite what Captain Planet tries to teach our kids. Marginal analysis helps us use resources wisely by asking, is the next step of cleanup worth it? How clean is clean enough for us? Or what are the additional benefits and additional costs of going to the next level? Marginal analysis also illustrates for us the fact that additional pollution cleanup becomes increasingly costly the cleaner the environment gets. You can see that in the chart of the homeowners project. Notice that for each $1 million expenditure, the amount of additional pollution cleanup goes down. And that's just common sense when you think about what's actually happening. It costs less to haul old junk out of the stream bed than it does to remove bacteria with high-tech filters. Now, you can illustrate this concept to your students with a simple clean up your room story. Suppose your teenagers want to go out on Friday night, but they've made the fatal mistake of leaving the doors to their rooms open so that you can see the disaster when you walk by. You tell them they can't go out until they clean up the room. You take the car keys and you tell them you'll be back in 15 minutes. Now, imagine that when you come back, the difference is going to be pretty noticeable. Clothes are off the floor and in the hamper, the bedspread's been pulled up, the books are off the bed and on the desk, shoes have been thrown into the closet. It looks a lot better in 15 minutes. But you're a parent, you're not fooled. Not good enough, you say. I'll be back in another 15 minutes. This time, the bed actually gets made, the clothes in the closet are hung up, the room's been vacuumed. It doesn't look a whole lot different, but you can tell that it's cleaner. Now, imagine that you get stubborn and you keep imposing the 15-minute work periods. By the fourth or fifth one, the kids are reduced to things like dusting the baseboards with a toothbrush or the rungs on the desk chair. The additional cleanliness has diminished significantly for each additional cost of 15 minutes. And that's true with environmental cleanup as well, although the costs and benefits certainly give us greater pause than comparing a clean bedroom to 15 minutes of free time. Here, for example, is a marginal analysis of Superfund cleanup projects. $12 billion to prevent one case of cancer. Sure seems like we could do a lot of other beneficial things with $12 billion. That is, unless the one case of cancer is someone you love. We're not arguing here that the decisions are easy, just that marginal analysis certainly can make them much clearer. Okay, this is the end of Lecture 7-1. We'll continue our study of how economic reasoning applies to property rights issues in Lecture 7-2. So, please check the announcements and the lesson guides for directions to take the next steps in Lesson 7.